has decided to prioritize the development of green and blue economies. Furthermore, we are also well positioned through our recent membership to the high-level panel on ocean sustainability to design and champion a sustainable blue economy, which will grow our economic base and create the much-needed jobs, while also tackling climate change. Additionally, Namibia has made progress in incubating renewable energy assets in the form of green hydrogen and ammonia as part of its energy order to enable us to act in the best interest of our planet and its citizens. To this extent, Africa has come a long way from the days of first wave of African leaders who paved the way towards independence. These leaders were extraordinary personalities who definitely forced us to fight for our African leaders were followed by a second wave of African leaders who were caught up in a Cold War confusion. Issue. Namibia wishes to amplify the statement by Secretary General Guterres, who explicitly stated that leaders on both sides should resume a meaningful dialogue, recognizing the two-state solution as the only pathway to
not only COVID-19 stop at our national borders or differentiate among nations, religions, or ideologies. We can deal with all global challenges, be them security, pandemics, or climate change, only with more empathy, solidarity. Ladies and gentlemen, the reality today is that our world is far from being a safe place to live in. Conflict has consequences to restructure economies and secure further
by the head of state. You have the floor, representative of Nauru.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have the distinct honor to introduce the pre-recorded statement of His Excellency, Honorable Lionel Ruane Ngamia, President of the Republic of Nauru.
Mr. President, it is an honor to address the opening of the 76th session of the United Nations General Assembly, albeit virtually rather than in person once again. On behalf of the Republic of Nauru, I would like to congratulate Your Excellency Mr. Abdullah Shahid on your recent assumption of the presidency of the General Assembly. Let me assure you of my delegation's full cooperation and support as you steer our important work during this session. It is heartwarming to see a fellow islander take on this prestigious role, bringing our shared challenges, resilience, and the vibrancy of big ocean states to the forefront of the work of the General Assembly. I would also like to thank His Excellency Mr. Volkan Bozkir for his exceptional stewardship of this august body during the 75th anniversary session. Mr. President, this past year has truly been a turning point for the untold human suffering. From these adversaries, we must remain hopeful, and the hope of our shared humanity must inspire bold action. The obstacles facing the global community now, in many ways, mirror the history of Nauru. We have survived epidemics that decimated our population, rebuilt and recovered from the scourge of world wars, overcome exploitation, and have experienced great prosperity and great loss. Persevering through it all with the lesson that we are all deeply connected and that an outbreak in one corner. Climate change is the greatest threat. Our neighbours in the Pacific echo the alarms raised at the recent findings on the Intergovernmental Panel of the 2030 Agenda, SDGs, and our national plans that provides a platform for sustainable livelihoods. As such, we welcome the proposal for a Transforming Education Summit in 2022 and coalition to promote and track green jobs and career paths for youth. We also welcome the establishment of the President of the General Assembly's Youth Fellowship Program, in particular, the focus on building capacity for young professionals from countries in special situations. Mr. President, I will conclude in hope for our ability to come together in solidarity to overcome COVID-19, address climate change and achieve equality. Let's hand in hand, shoulder to shoulder, as Scripture guides us, walk forward to meet the challenges of tomorrow. Together we can deliver for we the peoples. May God bless the Republic of Nauru, and may God bless the United Nations.
On behalf of the General Assembly, I wish to thank the President of the Republic of Nauru for the statement just made. The Assembly will now hear the statement of the distinguished representative of Zimbabwe to introduce an address by the head of state. You have the floor.
Mr. President, it is my singular honor and privilege to introduce the pre-recorded statement by His Excellency Dr. Emmerson Dambudzo Mnangagwa, the President of the Republic of Zimbabwe, to the general debate of the 6th session of the United Nations General Assembly. I thank you.
Your Excellency Abdullah Shahid, President of the 76th session of the General Assembly, Your Excellency Antonio Guterres, Secretary General of the United Nations, Majesties, Excellencies, Heads of State and Government, ladies and gentlemen, allow me, Your Excellency, to extend my heartfelt congratulations to you on your election as the President of the 76th session of the General Assembly. We are confident that your vast experience will help advance the implementation of the global agenda during this session. I also pay tribute to the outgoing President, Mr. Volker Boske, for providing outstanding leadership during the 75th session at a time when the COVID-19 pandemic negatively impacted the work of our organization. Allow me, Mr. President, to congratulate the United Nations Secretary General, Mr. Antonio Guterres, on his election for a second term. My country stands ready to work closely with him and other member states to achieve our shared goal of a better life for all. The 76th session is convening against the backdrop of the persistent COVID-19 pandemic. However, all hope is not lost. Drawing from the collective milestones achieved to date, enhanced multilateralism and a unity of purpose remain critical in mitigating this global health emergency. The hoarding and inequitable distribution with the resultant uneven vaccination patterns across the globe is not acceptable. Vaccine nationalism is self-defeating and contrary to the mantra that no one is safe until everyone is safe. Whether in the global north or south, rich or poor, old or young, all peoples of the world deserve access to vaccines. The pandemic has demonstrated the urgent need to build resilient economies and societies that are able to cope in times of shocks and hazards. The pandemic has necessitated the need for us to build back better and greener, to emerge stronger. The theme for the 76th session, and I quote, building resilience through hope to recover from COVID-19, rebuild sustainably, respond to the needs of the planet, respect the rights of people, and revitalize the United Nations resonates well with the needs of the world at this juncture. Together, we can indeed conquer the challenges facing humanity and realize a sustainable future that leaves no one behind. We must restore dignity and hope, particularly for our women, youth, and the vulnerable, who look to us for inspiration and assurance that their well-being and future remains at the core of all our endeavors. Mr. President, this year's high-level meetings mark important dialogues at the heart of sustainable development in its three dimensions: the Biodiversity Summit and the second Global Sustainable Transport Conference, as well as the Nutrition for Growth Summit, all lined up this year, complement our efforts towards a healthy planet. Green energy is an enabler for building back better and is crucial to the direct achievement of SDGs, while playing a key role in mitigating climate change. The high-level dialogue on energy sets the stage for exploring viable, renewable, and green energy solutions. As we do so, let us link economic growth with the accelerated transition to net zero emission for a climate-resilient future. My country and the parts of Southern African region continue to experience the devastating impacts of climate change, ranging from cyclone-induced floods, recurrent droughts, and shorter rain seasons, hotter summers, and the colder winters. This is in spite of the fact that our continent is the least polluter. COP26 in Glasgow must therefore be about action and the fulfillment of decisions of the past. In addition, concrete financial support is essential to combat climate change beyond mere rhetoric. The 2030 Agenda remains our shared roadmap to achieve the future we all want. For us in Zimbabwe, eradicating poverty and eliminating hunger remains a top priority. Climate change and resultant erratic weather patterns, growing populations, coupled with the effects of the pandemic on food supply chains, demand a shift from our traditional food production, processing, distribution, and consumption patterns. My government has established a firm foundation for sustained food production through the land distribution program, as well as increased support for communal and smallholder farmers. This has led to broader and sustainable incomes for the majority of people living in rural areas, who now contribute to the increased levels of household and national food and nutrition security. The United Nations Food Systems Summit provides a welcome platform for new actions, innovative solutions, and the plans to deliver progress across all of the SDGs and the Paris agreement. Mr. President, Zimbabwe launched Vision 2030, aimed at improving the lives of our people while sustainably managing the environment and ensuring that no one is left behind. The pursuit of this inclusive and transformative vision has seen the creation of more decent jobs, reduction of inequalities, and access to quality social services. Expanded new economic opportunities for all citizens are yielding positive results across all sectors of the economy. The multi-pronged reforms we are undertaking have seen us being one of the fastest movers in the World Bank Ease of Doing Business Index. Zimbabwe presented the second voluntary national review during the July 2021 high-level political forum. Remarkable progress has been registered towards universal health coverage and the creation of a competence-based education system which involves innovation for a knowledge-driven economy. Higher agricultural production and productivity through improved land and water utilization, as well as the adoption of climate-smart agriculture, is being promoted. The voluntary national review further highlighted progress made in supporting productive employment, decent work, and the formalization of the informal sector. My administration continues to entrench democracy, constitutionalism, and the rule of law through sound legislation as well as fair and impartial administration of justice. This is indicative of our strides to achieve sustainable development by 2030. We remain available to share experiences for mutual benefit. My government recognizes and applauds the complementary role that the private sector, development partners, civil society organizations, and other stakeholders play in the realization of SDGs in Zimbabwe. In speaking of challenges faced in achieving SDGs, the COVID-19 pandemic has increased the vulnerability of our economy, which is already crippled by the adverse effects of unilateral illegal sanctions imposed on my country. Sanctions have further worsened our capacity to respond to the pandemic for the good of our citizens. I'm pleased to highlight that my government has approved the visit in October 2021 to Zimbabwe by the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the negative impact of the unilateral coercive measures on the enjoyment of human rights. This will afford the Special Rapporteur an opportunity to witness firsthand the devastating impact of these illegal sanctions on my country. We reiterate our call for the urgent and conditional removal of these illegal sanctions. Zimbabwe remains grateful to the SADC region, the African Union, and other progressive nations who continue to stand with us and add their voices to the call for the unconditional removal of these unwarranted and unjustified illegal sanctions. We are committed to engagement and re-engagement and peaceful coexistence and to be a friend to all and an enemy to none, as we build equal partnerships for win-win cooperation and a common future. Mr. President, the state of global peace and security is a cause for concern. Terrorism, illicit flow of small arms and light weapons, transnational organized crime, cybercrime, and illicit financial flows, among other aspects, continue to impede our march towards the realization of sustainable peace, security, and stability. The recent acts of terrorism in our SADC region are constant reminders of our vulnerability to this scourge, which has become one of Africa's greatest security threats. African nations need to be capacitated to effectively counter this threat, along with the Continental Flagship Program on, and I quote, silencing the guns through African solutions for African problems, end of quote. As we commemorate the International Day for the Total Elimination of Nuclear Weapons during this high-level week, let us be mindful of the need to build trust based on international law to realize the shared goal of a world free of nuclear weapons. We remain alarmed by the global rise in racial tensions, violence, and hate crimes. 20 years after the Durban Declaration and the program of action, the socio-economic and political structures that encourage, promote, and justify racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and the related intolerances must be torn down. The recent adoption of the resolution is commendable. The forum must inspire all of us to build a world which harnesses our racial diversities for global peace, harmony, and sustainable development. Respecting and upholding human rights is the obligation of all states as enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations. Equally, self-determination and independence are fundamental rights that should be enjoyed by all peoples. We therefore call for the full implementation of United Nations resolutions to end all forms of colonialism and occupation. Mr. President, based on the principles of sovereign equality and independence of states, the United Nations organization must be fair, just, and anchored on multilateralism, inclusivity, and transparency to best serve the collective interests of all members. The reform of the Security Council must be expedited. Equally, my country supports the ongoing efforts to revitalize the General Assembly. The encroachment by other United Nations organs on the mandate and competence of the General Assembly is of concern. Finally, the increased challenges facing the world today call for a stronger solidarity and a renewed commitment to strengthen multilateralism as a viable mechanism for achieving and maintaining peace, security, equality, justice, and sustainable economic development, and the protection of our environment. I thank you.
On behalf of the General Assembly, I wish to thank His Excellency, the President of the Republic of Zimbabwe, for his statement. And now, on behalf of the General Assembly, I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Republic of Chad to introduce an address by the head of state.
Okay. Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. President. Distinguished delegates, I have the honor to introduce His Excellency Mohamed Idris Deby, President of the Transitional Military Council, President of the Republic of Chad, to present his statement. Thank you. Mr. President of the General Assembly, heads of state and delegations, Mr. Secretary General of the United Nations, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen. At the outset, I would like to extend my warm congratulations to His Excellency Abdallah Shahid on his brilliant election to the presidency of the 76th session of the United Nations General Assembly, and to wish him every success in his mission. Chad assures him of its support throughout his mandate. I would also like to extend our sincere gratitude and pay deserved tribute to His Excellency Volkan Bozkır, outgoing President of the General Assembly, for having successfully carried out his mandate despite the difficult context marked by the COVID-19 pandemic. Likewise, I would like to warmly congratulate His Excellency Mr. Antonio Guterres, Secretary General of the United Nations, on his brilliant re-election on June 18th, and thank him for his leadership. Chad reiterates its support and high appreciation to the Secretary General for the excellent work during his previous mandate and his dynamism in the face of the COVID-19 pandemic. Chad commends the quality and relevance of the important reforms that he has carried out in the pillars of peace and security, development system management, as well as the gender parity strategy within the United Nations system. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the theme of this session, namely building resilience through hope to recover from COVID-19, rebuild sustainably, respond to the needs of the planet, respect the rights of people, and revitalize the United Nations, eloquently reflects the multiple challenges the world continues to face for the second year in a row as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. This pandemic has traumatized humanity by the magnitude of its multifaceted and multidimensional impacts across the planet. It continues to wreak havoc, straining our health systems, our economies, our public finances, and even the functioning and security of our states, to name but a few. With more than 4.5 million dead and 220 million persons infected, as well as completely devastated economies around the world, developing countries in general, and those in Africa in particular, have been deeply impacted due to their structural vulnerabilities. given the persistence of the pandemic and its devastating consequences, mobilization is required in order to amplify the response to the pandemic and sustainably support recovery efforts for the post-COVID-19 period. In this regard, I note with regret that the inequality in access to vaccines remains great. Rich countries have achieved immunization coverage above 50%, while most African countries are below 2%. According to the World Health Organization, of the more than 5 billion doses administered worldwide, only 2% have gone to Africa. Nothing could justify this imbalance, given the interdependence of our world and the need to eradicate the virus from the entire planet. In that context, it is incomprehensible, in fact, unacceptable, that some countries are stockpiling surplus vaccines while others are in dire need of them. The virus knows no continents nor borders, to say nothing of nationality or social status. Unvaccinated countries and regions will be a source of spread of the virus and the emergence of new variants. In this regard, we welcome the repeated calls by the Secretary General of the United Nations and the Director General of WHO to make the vaccine accessible to all. The salvation of all mankind depends on it. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, improving the prospects for post-COVID-19 economic recovery is closely linked to improving the health situation or the eradication of the virus and end of the pandemic. This expected economic recovery is also dependent on reducing the divide in all areas between the North and the South. Developing countries severely affected by COVID-19 are already facing various recurring obstacles, the collapse of the tourism sector, and so on. In addition, the least developed countries and landlocked developing countries, including Chad, are also affected by the non-fulfillment of commitments made under the 2030 Agenda and the Addis Ababa Program of Action in the area of official development assistance. Chad once again launches an urgent appeal to all our partners in the North to honor their commitments to vulnerable countries with a view to contributing in a sustainable manner to a better post-COVID-19 economic recovery and accelerating progress towards the SDGs in accordance with the noble ambition of the United Nations to leave no one behind by the 2030 deadline. In that light, Chad reiterates the call repeatedly made by the member countries of the G5 Sahel relating to the cancellation of the debt of these countries, which have been hard hit by terrorism and climate change, in addition to COVID-19 and widespread poverty. It should be recalled that the absence of prospects for young people in the Sahel pushes them into the trap of extremist ideologies and prompts them to pursue illegal migration to Europe with all the risks that this entails. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, as you are aware, following the tragic death of its president, the late Marshal Idriss Déby Itno, who fell on the field of honor on April 20th while combating mercenaries from Libya, Chad began a period of political transition. A transitional military council was set up to ensure the continuity of state functions and guarantee the security of the country, which is seriously threatened by heavily armed attackers plaguing the south of Libya. A broad-based government headed by a civilian prime minister was put in place on May 2nd, 2021, and it is working hard to meet the deadlines to complete the transition process. A roadmap for the transition was drawn up and adopted in July. It focuses around three main axes. One, strengthening security and defense. Two, organizing an inclusive dialogue and consolidating peace and national unity. And three, strengthening good governance and the rule of law. The implementation of this roadmap, the cost of which is estimated at nearly $1.3 billion, is beyond the reach of Chad alone and requires substantial support from our partners through an urgent mobilization of the necessary financial resources. In view of the enormous security, economic, financial, and health challenges facing the transitional government, Chad appeals to the international community for strong support. In the same vein, all the necessary arrangements have been made to hold an inclusive national dialogue, the modalities for the organization and conduct of which are currently being examined by a committee that has been set up for this purpose. In addition, for the sake of bringing all Chadians together, including armed groups, a special technical committee was established to facilitate the participation of political military forces in the inclusive national dialogue. In addition, following the broad and intensive consultations currently in progress, the National Transitional Council, which will assume the role of a provisional parliament, will be set up. The national reconciliation process is in any case well underway and is evolving at a pace that is appreciated both by national actors as well as by most of our partners. In this regard, it is my pleasure to note the return to the fold of several of our compatriots in exile and members of certain armed groups who are responding favorably to the policy of the outstretched hand of the government. I urge all of our brothers who are still outside their country to return without fear or hesitation. They will occupy their rightful place, and their invaluable contribution to the effort of national reconciliation and the building of our country is greatly desired and awaited. We will welcome them all with open arms. With this in mind, and aware of our duty before history and before the Chadian people, I would like to reassure this august assembly that nothing will undermine our commitment and our determination to conclude the current transition process. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, Chad, which shares more than 1,000 kilometers of common borders with Libya and is linked to this brotherly neighboring country by the ties of history, geography, and culture, even by blood ties, is suffering the full brunt of the consequences of the Libyan crisis in terms of the recurrent armed attacks launched from the south of that country. The most recent attack against Chad between April 11th and 29th, and which caused the death of our former president, the late Idriss Déby Itno, was an unfortunate illustration of this, and not to mention the chronic insecurity and instability that has extended well beyond in the Sahel since 2012. It should be recalled in this regard that the UN Security Council, during its meeting held on April 29th at the request of its African members, established a direct link between the withdrawal of mercenaries and foreign fighters from Libya and the aforementioned tragic events in Chad. With this in mind, Chad expresses its deep concern at the strong pressure from the international community demanding an immediate departure of mercenaries, foreign fighters, and other irregular armed forces from Libya. Such a departure of Chadian nationals recruited, trained, supervised, armed, and financed for the needs of the war in Libya will not be without consequences for the security of Chad. That is why Chad once again urges the international community, and in particular the UN Security Council, to take all necessary measures for the establishment of a supervisory mechanism for a planned and coordinated departure of these elements. Chad is in favor of a disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration process for its nationals serving in Libyan factions who renounce violence and mercenary activity to return to their country. We are counting on the leadership and the crucial role of the United Nations in leading this process and mobilizing the resources necessary to finance it. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, we cannot talk about the Libyan crisis without addressing the gravity of the security situation in the Sahel and its environs. It is marked by the spread of terrorism, organized crime, and illicit trafficking in arms, drugs, and human beings. The increase in terrorist attacks against the armed forces of the G5 countries and the Lake Chad Basin countries, as well as the civilian populations in Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, illustrate the resilience of terrorist groups and their capacity to do. The sacrifices made by the G5 Sahel Force and the National Joint Task Force against Boko Haram in the Lake Chad Basin have been enormous, but the danger persists and terrorists continue to wreak havoc, plunging innocent civilian populations into desolation and despair. In the face of this threat, which transcends borders and puts a serious strain on our individual capacities to react, we must review our response approaches and pool our efforts to better adapt responses to the changing context and challenges on the ground. The G5 Sahel countries are tackling this by mobilizing their meager military material and financial resources. Likewise, the response to the terrorist threat should integrate dimensions related to economic development, climate change, youth education, and access to basic social services by our populations. From this perspective, our countries affected by the scourge of terrorism, which is considered a threat to peace and security, have the right to count on the solidarity of the international community in a spirit of complementarity. We have no choice but to act together in the face of global challenges. Chad also underscores the imperative need for greater multifaceted support, both to the aforementioned joint forces and to their individual member states. To this end, Chad once again reiterates the appeal repeatedly launched by the Conference of the Heads of State of the G5 Sahel to the UN Security Council to grant the G5 Sahel Joint Force a mandate under Chapter 7 of the United Nations Charter in order to ensure its sustainable and funding. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, Chad reaffirms its position of principle regarding the reform of the United Nations, in particular its Security Council. This reform, which has been called for by Africa for a number of years, simply reflects the legitimate aspiration of more than 1,200,000,000 Africans. How can we ignore this persistent call from an entire continent that has been unjustly excluded from a body which claims to be representative of all humanity and justice and equity of all nations, which are dear founding values of the United Nations? And Chad reiterates its commitment to the African Common Position as expressed in the Eswatini Consensus and the Sirte Declaration. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, in conclusion, I would like to express to His Excellency Antonio Guterres, Secretary General of the United Nations, to his organization and to all its member states, as well as to the regional organizations present in this room, our sincere gratitude and our deep recognition for the solidarity and moral support shown towards Chad following the tragic and sudden passing of the former president, the late Idriss Déby Itno. And finally, in the name of the founding principles of the United Nations and in that of friendship between the peoples, Chad reiterates its call to lift the embargo unjustly imposed on Cuba, which is seriously harming this country. With that, I wish us every success in our work, and I thank you for your kind attention.
On behalf of the General Assembly, I would like to thank the President of the Transitional Military Council and President of the Republic of Chad for the statement delivered. And also for the introduction made by my sister, the Permanent Representative of Chad. Thank you very much. The Assembly will now hear an address by His Excellency Azali Assoumani, President of the Union of the Comoros. I request protocol to escort His Excellency. On behalf of the General Assembly, I have the honor to welcome to the United Nations His Excellency Mr. Azali Assoumani, President of the Union of the Comoros, and invite him to address the Assembly. Mr. President, you have the floor. Your Excellency, President of the General Assembly, Your Excellency, Secretary General of the United Nations, Majesties, Highnesses, Excellencies, distinguished representatives of countries and institutions. Assalamu alaikum. I would like first of all to express to the US authorities my warm and sincere thanks for the warm welcome that they have given us. And this happens every time we come to this beautiful city of New York to take part in this great annual gathering. And I would like to express our sincere sympathy to the American people who are remembering in this month of September 2021 the 20th commemoration of the cowardly attacks of September 2001. And I associate myself to the tribute paid to the victims of these barbaric acts. I would also like to join my voice to those of eminent personalities who have preceded me on this rostrum in order to express my warm congratulations to His Excellency Mr. Abdullah Shahid on his outstanding election to the presidency of this 76th regular session of the United Nations General Assembly. My delegation and myself are convinced that your human and professional qualities will ensure the success of the current session. Allow me also to take this opportunity to pay due tribute to your predecessor, His Excellency Mr. Volkan Bozkır, for the effectiveness in his leading of the 75th session and how he so aptly fulfilled his mission. And on behalf of my country and my delegation, I would like to express my sincere congratulations to His Excellency Mr. Antonio Guterres, Secretary General of the United Nations, and congratulate him on his remarkable re-election for a new mandate. And I would also like to express to him our appreciation and recognition of his ongoing investment as well as that of his entire team to serve the United Nations, an organization which is facing challenges which make its action ever more difficult but still indispensable. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, delegates, this 76th session of the General Assembly is being held at a particularly crucial time in the history of the world and our organization. It is being held at a time when the family of nations are deploying their best efforts to manage and overcome the COVID-19 pandemic and its variants, which for almost 2 years now have brought the people of the world to their knees. On behalf of my delegation, I would like to welcome the waves of beneficial solidarity which have made it possible to avoid the worst. Indeed, after the shock of the initial days and weeks, human solidarity established and laid the foundation for a fight which gradually has enabled us to regain the upper hand over events. In this regard, the Union of the Comoros welcomes the effective work of men and women, scholars, researchers, experts, and the laboratories for their investment in the research and production of vaccines against this virus, and which finally have managed to give the world hope. Of course, we cannot forget here the sacrifices made by these thousands of men and women, healthcare workers of all categories, who on the front lines of this battle and at the risk of their own lives, have in each of our countries been able to find the courage and the strength to brave the storm posed by this lethal enemy. To all of you, to each and every one of them, bravo, and a huge thanks. Mr. President, honourable delegates, the COVID-19 pandemic has devastated the economies of the world and upended the balance created centuries ago by states, nations and peoples. And it has forced us to live in a different way. We have been living since November 29, the date when it first made its appearance in the world, through an unprecedented crisis, a real world war. The pandemic has slowed down our lives. It has further deepened the gap between rich and poor. It has accelerated inequality and has disturbed the equilibrium of our national economies. No country has been spared of this. The pandemic has also revealed the sheer scale of the technological divide existing between countries and has shown us the importance of the new information and communication technologies and the need to act urgently to reduce this divide. Also, the inequalities observed in access to vaccines underscore the need to act in order to firmly anchor this spirit of solidarity, and it recalls to us the overriding role of multilateralism. And that is why, all together, with stronger solidarity, which really has its place at the heart of multilateralism, it is in that spirit that we must act to rebuild the world and save the nations and peoples. It is by including the magnitude of this reality that we will succeed in the work of this 76th session of the General Assembly of the United Nations and those of other major international gatherings, particularly the upcoming World Food Summit, COP26, and the 5th United Nations Conference on the Least Developed Countries. The subject of our meeting touches on the reform of our organization, which represents the best that we have to offer to the world in our ongoing quest for lasting peace and security. This meeting offers us as well an opportunity to evaluate the performance of our organization with a view to guaranteeing a better representation of developing countries and particularly of those of the African continent, which, let's be reminded, include both areas of dynamic economic growth but also of conflicts, sometimes bloody conflicts, which delay development and the well-being of our peoples. The community of nations that we represent has the duty to address these problems, because if they're not resolved, They will mean that our organization loses its credibility, particularly in matters related to the sovereignty and territorial integrity of states. And I reiterate here on behalf of my government and the Comoran people the overriding need for a rapid, just and fair solution to the issue of Palestine, a solution that will establish the right of the Palestinian people to have a sovereign state with East Jerusalem as its capital, living in harmony and in complete security and harmony with the State of Israel. And I understand the position of some brotherly nations in the Arab world who have renewed their relations with the State of Israel. It is up to the State of Israel to understand the import of these bold initiatives and to take account of them in everyone's interest. Moreover, and with a view to a lasting solution for the Moroccan Sahara, which is of great concern to my government, I would like to express here my encouragement for the efforts undertaken by the Kingdom of Morocco, and we hope that they will lead to a solution which will make it possible for this brotherly nation to recover its autonomy and territorial integrity over this Moroccan province. My government welcomes any initiative which will contribute to ensuring peace in the region and strongly encourages dialogue between the two brotherly nations, namely the Kingdom of Morocco and the People's Democratic Republic of Algeria. And along the same lines with regard to sovereignty, the Union of the Comoros repeats its position for the need for the People's Republic of China to recover control over the Chinese province of Taiwan. With regard to the territorial dispute between France and the Comoros relating to the Comorian island of Mayotte, in recent years we have seen a willingness on the part of both parties, the Comoros and France, to build on what has been achieved in our common history whilst maintaining a frank and constructive dialogue with a view to arriving peacefully at a lasting and respectful solution, one that respects international law and which is in the interests of both parties. The areas of tension which endanger peace in various parts of the world have become fertile ground for the outbreak of international terrorism in the Sahel, for example, and more recently in southern Africa and in the Indian Ocean area. We must not remain indifferent to these situations. The situation in Afghanistan is also of concern, and I would like to express the support of my country to the Afghan people in this crucial phase of their history. The recent unconstitutional changes that have taken place in a number of countries in Africa and throughout the world recall to us the overall necessity of thinking about innovative and lasting solutions which look beyond short-term geopolitical stakes. In order to build peace, security, and stability in the world, we therefore need to have a strong consensus, and stress should be placed at all times on preventing conflicts, whilst at the same time supporting efforts to resolve crises as they emerge. Mr. President, honourable delegates, the principles and values of the United Nations today are centred on the Sustainable Development Goals, which each country has made its priority. They are an ideal platform for establishing our collective commitment and on which we can rely as we carry out our action in favour of development. And in this process, as was shown in the voluntary national report of my country, which we presented in 2020 to the high-level political forum, the Union of the Comoros is engaged on a path that will enable us to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals in all areas. The Emerging Comoros Plan 2030 is the national reference framework for this. Moreover, I would recall that at the time when we begin this meeting, according to research into these matters, entire regions are due to disappear, whereas others will be subject to an intensification of climate phenomena such as floods, intense droughts, fires, the erosion of coastline, or the acidification of the oceans. Consequences of the disastrous effects of the degradation of our environment. Although these phenomena do not spare any country or any region, we must stress that it is the small island developing states, the Comoros is part of this group, that is the most concerned and which requires greater attention on the part of the leaders that we represent here. Indeed, these states, as well as many others, are also facing other dangerous phenomena such as maritime piracy, human trafficking at sea, drug trafficking, illegal fishing, and the plundering of the sea's resources. My government joins all national and global initiatives to fight these barbaric acts mercilessly, because they are a major threat to the security of our respective populations. And this is why I plan to reorient the strategy of our diplomacy in order to include the dimension of security in our geostrategic actions, particularly in the Mozambique Channel area and the southwest region of the Indian Ocean. This new vision requires the support of neighbouring countries and our partners in development, and it has become the basis for any thinking about the future in this part of the world, so that there can be a sustainable and blue managed economy. This represents immense and vital potential. Nationally, I'm convinced of the need for political stability. This is the guarantee for socio-economic development, and my government works tirelessly towards this goal. Political stability, national cohesion are something very cherished by my country because they govern all initiatives. Our salvation resides in a peaceful society that is held together and is inclusive of all the